Welcome back to Central Valley Talk. I'm Mike Briggs, your host today, and we are learning how to survive in the age of COVID. Are you a parent? Are you home with your kids? Have your kids started school and you're learning how to use Zoom and computers and stuff like that? Do you have a business that's closed? We want to hear about how you are surviving COVID. What are you doing different? Has the world just shut down? Or are there still things for people to do? Are there things for kids to do? Well, we've searched the Central Valley, we've searched the state of California, we've searched the whole country, and we found a very, very cool thing going on coming up on Saturday, August 29th. And the thing we found is a sci-fi, it's online virtual Sci-Fi Afrofuturism Day Camp. That's a lot to say, but our guest is he's an author, Dr. Glenn Parris. Welcome, Dr. Parris.
Hey, how you guys doing?
Now, you look like you're right down the road. Where are you?
I'm in Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta, Georgia. That's like one of the clearest pictures we've had on these Zoom calls since we started doing this. By the way,
I apologize for the clarity of the picture.
No, it looks really good. Now, 3-4 months ago,
I got a face made for radio.
You look great. A couple months ago, we did all of our interviews with people sitting next to me. Now almost all of our interviews are like this. We're remote. We're, I don't know, thousands of miles apart, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
Now, by the way, you are actually a medical doctor, and you're from New York, and for some reason you relocated to Atlanta.
Yeah, it's a little warmer out here.
Yeah, I bet it is.
Actually, my specialty is rheumatology.
Okay.
And as rheumatologists, we're actually immunologists.
Okay.
So we're very, very involved and very, very interested in a lot of the things that we're seeing with COVID. So we're all trying to navigate this new normal. We're trying to find commonality and predictability in this virus and its patterns of infection and how best to survive this. And this is an interesting throwback to the time before antibiotics and the time before a lot of our technology, because we're dealing with something that's very difficult to detect, and that is, at least right now, untreatable and uncurable. And all we're doing is throwing support to patients who are suffering from COVID.
Interesting. So, I did an editorial yesterday and said, this is what I know about COVID. I don't know anything about it, but we see a lot of people out here in California, and they're experts saying it's a hoax and don't wear a mask and things like that. I'm thinking, these guys didn't even graduate from high school. I studied linear regression analysis, and I can't figure it out. But I'm glad there's people like you out there that are thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, I remind a lot of our patients that, Typhoid Mary was actually a real person. She was an Irish cook in the first few years of the 20th century. And we found that she was patient 1 for a typhoid outbreak in New York. But she didn't believe in the germ theory. She didn't believe that she was causing anybody to get sick because she herself was not sick.
Right. Wow.
And they eventually actually had to lock her up in an asylum, not because she was insane, but because she was a danger to society. Right. She was a health hazard. Wow. We contained that typhoid outbreak, but she lived in isolation until the 1940s.
I did not know that. We've all heard of Typhoid Mary, of course. Now, I listed my number one goal during COVID is to not kill my 85-year-old parents. So I'm being very careful, probably not as careful as I should, but out here in California, there's a bunch of crazies who says there's nothing to worry about. So,
look, you got folks like that everywhere. And unfortunately, they're going to believe it when someone close to them has a close call or has, a horrible outcome. And that's a horrible way to learn about how serious this is.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about this for an hour, but I'm going to get to the subject.
Well, I'll come back.
I'd like to have you back, and we'll talk about COVID, and just especially from your perspective. I'm going to talk about this event. I want to ask you a few questions about your book, and then I want to circle back to the event and try to get some people to be involved, because a lot of parents are stuck at home right now, and they're going crazy, with the kids at home, and they're looking for things, creative things to do. And this is it's called Online Virtual Sci-Fi Afrotourism Day Camp. Tell me about that.
Well, Afrofuturism.
Futurism, okay.
Yeah, that's okay. But Afrofuturism has to do with science fiction, science fantasy from an African or African diaspora perspective. So most of our science fiction is Eurocentric. You know, and we've seen a lot of it. Of course, my favorites are Isaac Asimov, Frank Herbert. You know, I love Orson Scott Card, and George R. R. Martin. He's actually a wonderful guy. But you know, the theme is you write from whence you come. So you don't have a lot of African American science fiction authors. There are certainly more now than when I first started 25 years ago. At that time, there was Samuel L. Delaney, there was Octavia Butler, there was Steve Barnes. That was it. I was the next one. I was the fourth one. And I had no idea when I began writing that there were so few science fiction writers of my type. And what's interesting is, you know, we all think the same way. I mean, you know, when I sit down at my table with my family, you know, we talk about the same thing that you sit down and talk about your family with. You know, it's not a lot of difference, but there's some subtle differences, and some of those differences are informed by my heritage, my history, my experiences. And there are certain things that I deal with, and sometimes they're very subtle, that you will never deal with, you'll never understand. And a lot of times there's a whole story exchanged in a glance. So Afrofuturism was, it really dates back to the 1960s. When Star Trek first came on the air, Lieutenant Uhura, Michelle Nichols, was the lone African-American figure on the show. And after a few episodes, she was a little stressed, and she was talking about leaving the show. And she got a call. She got a call from Martin Luther King, Jr.
Wow.
And he begged her not to leave the show. And she says, "You don't know what I'm going through here." He says, "Yeah, but you don't know what you're doing for the community. Your presence on a show like this tells us that we're going to be there in the future." And he was very, very serious. He was a big fan. And she stuck it out, and she went through all 3 seasons. But what he said to her is true. So, you know, if we can't tell our story, other people will tell our story, and they will tell it wrong. They'll tell it badly. And this is really what I want to teach kids. And I don't care what the kid looks like. They can be African American, Afro-Caribbean, they can be African, they can be Asian, they can be South Asian, they can be Native American, they can be Scandinavian, they can be, you know, Scotch-Irish from the North Georgia mountains. All right? But tell the story in your voice. All right? Hollywood sort of has no offense, but Hollywood sort of has a formula of what happens and the order that it happens. You know, one of the reasons that I think the Black Panther was so moving to everybody is it incorporated themes from, you know, the diaspora, from, you know, the colonial era, from the 1960s and all the turmoil then. And this is even before, you know, a lot of the lid boiled over from the Black Lives Matter and all the unjust killings that have been taking place. The story that immigrants have, the story that African Americans have, the story that Latinos have are very, very different from the stories of other families. It's not completely different, but there are subtleties that give a different twist on the climax, on the character development, on the resolution of some of these stories. They don't always have great happy endings.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes these stories that we really enjoy are tragic. Marvel has figured that out, and they're doing stories that don't always come out great. You know, there are tears at the end of a lot of their stories, but that's more realistic. That's more like life. What I want to teach kids, or teach kids, I want to encourage kids to do, is, you know, formulate their own stories, develop their stories, refine their stories, but keep their stories in their voice. You know, you don't have to copy or emulate what you see. You can have it inspire you, but you don't have to emulate that. You don't have to follow that formula.
Find your own voice and tell your story in your voice.
Right.
Now, before we get too far from this is Saturday, August 29th, 2020. Right. Now, it is sponsored by the Book Tavern and the MAC. MAC is, by the way, Merced. Anyway, Merced is a multicultural center. They're also sponsored out here in California, and it's free to the public to be involved in this. And in California, it's going to be to 1 to 3 p.m., same as back east. They're in a different time zone.
It's going to be the coolest thing, I think, to bounce ideas back and forth, and talk a little bit about how you do things. What's interesting is most science fiction authors have a very limited background in science. They do good research.
Yeah.
They may have some science background, some mathematics background. A good friend of mine has a PhD in history, and he's a terrific science fiction author. So you don't have to be a scientist to do it. My background is science, so when I talk about physics, it's because I do have a little experience with that. If I talk about biology, if I talk about epidemiology, if I talk about immunology, I do have some background in that. Now, one of the best bits of information that I've ever gotten was from Octavia Butler. When writing, I talked about my process with her a little bit. She asked me about that. And I said, I always like to do research to make sure I'm right. She says, never let the truth get in the way of telling a good story. And I've always loved that.
Nice. Now, I have noticed how well-researched science fiction writers do. They do a lot of research.
Do a lot of research, yeah.
Now, interesting, you have a science background.
Right.
So you have a little different approach, but...
Yeah. Well, no, I still have to do some research when I look things up.
I bet you have to do a lot of research.
Right. So if I want to look up a Rothschild radius and how that's going to calculate into doing terraforming, I got to look that up. If I want to pull in string theory, I've got to look that up. I'm not a Einsteinian physicist, when it comes to such things. So yeah, you still have to do the research. It may inform how well you understand some of what you research, but you still have to do that research. You do that homework. And when you write, you really have to be internally consistent with what you write.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you a couple questions about your book, but
sure.
First I wanted to say that I've lost my notes again. Kim Williams is a big help to you and to us. She sent lots of notes, but it's Merced Multicultural Arts Center in Merced, and it's the virtual Sci-Fi Afrofuturism Day Camp for young people to explore sci-fi with Dr. Glenn Parris. And by the way, he wrote this great book called The Dragon's Heir, the Archeologist Tale. Now, is this a kid's book? Because I'm reading through this material. I'm going to read this book.
Yeah, it's not a kid's book. And I advise everybody who reads it, start with the glossary in the back. We're looking at getting this republished, and the glossary is going to move to the front. But it's much, much easier if you read those 12 pages in the back, and it gives you a sense of the technology, the cultures, etc. This is allegory. This is really, there's all the stuff that you see in space operas of Star Trek and Star Wars, Avatar. You're going to get that. That's there. But there's subtext that's cultural. There's allegory to colonialism, to exploitation, to benign or malign neglect of species that are more vulnerable. And it's told in a way, it's not told as if reverse slavery or anything like that. That doesn't teach anything. All right. This is, how do you deal with a culture that is advanced enough to, travel through space faster than they do on Star Trek? How do you deal with a culture that's 65 million years ahead of you? How do you deal with the petty arrogance of someone who has that much on you.
Wow.
And we're all in that basket of deplorables as far as they're concerned. And the whole story is really told from the perspective of an individual who's along on this trip, a woman of privilege who, is used to everything being handed to her, and, she really has no purpose on the trip until she's captured by humans, and she is enjoying herself from the standpoint of she's an archaeologist, and she gets to look at something that no other Ifalu of her culture has ever seen before. But at the same time, she's fighting for her life. And she is looking at an infantile species with an infantile culture that is following in the footsteps of her culture. So a lot of the things that we're struggling with, she's seen this before.
She's already seen it.
A lot of the prejudices and things that we are trying to overcome, she's seen that before. So it's as if we are toddlers, and she's the grown-up in the room.
Now, just a peek at the book, it's kind of an alternative history, like where the dinosaurs go. We know they're not here now, but this kind of gives us different explanation of where they went. Right.
So if you think about mammals, lions and tigers and bears, why don't you look like a wolf? Why don't I look like a bear? Because we've evolved, we're people. All right. What if there were several races of people who were living 65 million years ago, and they were advanced enough to evacuate after an industrial accident devastates the Earth at the time of the KT event?
Yeah.
What if they left in a fleet of Noah's Arks to the stars? What would draw them back to Earth? Well, a cosmic pandemic of all things. There's a plague that threatens the entire food chain of trillions of people on millions of worlds. So they have to backtrack some 65 million years worth to a planet that they left behind to find untainted algae. And that's the premise of the book. And when they get here, they find a surprise. They find us.
Find us, okay. It's kind of timely. I mean, we're talking about getting off this planet right now and going to Mars and pandemic and where the dinosaurs go. But I guess the idea is for kids who participate in the camp, using your imagination.
Yeah, using your imagination, putting yourself in the place of someone who you can't understand, reaching for, someone who is other instead of pushing them away. And the value of taking care of your home. And when I say your home, I'm talking about this planet.
Yeah.
There are millions of planets in this galaxy. We're not going to find another planet exactly like Earth, with a biome exactly like Earth, that we can tolerate. We may find a place that is almost identical. I mean, and many of us have traveled. If you've traveled to Mexico, if you've traveled to South America or Africa, when you eat food in other places, there's bacteria there that you're not used to. Montezuma's revenge, we're going to get things that we're not accustomed to. What happens when you find another planet, even if it looks almost exactly like this one?
There'd be a lot of germs and a lot of bacteria that...
Right.
Yeah.
We got to take care of this marble. We got to take care of this big blue marble.
We're running out of time. I want to talk to you for hours, but I guess what we want to do is get these kids involved. Here's a way to get your kids involved in this kind of thinking, this kind of creativity, this kind of imagination, and that is this say it for me,
Afrofuturism.
Afrofuturism Day Camp. And kids from all over the country will be participating, I guess.
Right.
That'll be fun.
And it's open to all kids and teens. And again, you don't have to be African American or part of the African diaspora to enjoy this. It's get out of the box is the point of this.
Right.
Tell a story in your voice. There are a lot of barriers to publishing things that are not like other things that already exist.
Okay.
So it's very, very inbred. This is a really a great way to to spark innovation and really new stories.
Now, for our viewers, you see this the flyer scrolling on the screen. There's a link you could click to get involved in the day camp. If you just type in Google Afrofuturism Day Camp, you're going to find this. There's not 1,000 of these going on over the next couple of weeks. There's probably only one. So find it. Go to facebook.com events and put in the title we have there on the screen. But I bet if you just Google it, it's going to come up. But I tell you this, if you're watching and you want to get your kids involved in this and you can't figure out how to get on the Zoom, how to register for it, call me right here at Central Valley Talk, and I'll give you, I have tons and stacks of information here that Kim sent me on this, and we'll put you in touch with them. Also, the Merced Arts Center, Multicultural Arts Center in Merced will have information on it. Find information on it. Get involved. This is a great thing. Your kids have been at home all summer driving you crazy. They're starting to school, and that's a lot of stress right now trying to figure out how to do school online. This is something that's informational. It'll be fun, educational. Dr. Glenn Parris, we're out of time, but I'm going to just give you a moment if you want to add something on this whole thing.
Well, I just look forward to doing this. Before going to medical school, I taught 5th grade for a short period of time, and I loved it. You know, I love kids. I like listening to their ideas, and you know, I just want to make sure that we don't squash imagination, you know, in its most fertile time. You know, call in, watch it. Hopefully, we'll have it on a YouTube channel when we're done with this, so that, you know, if you miss it on the day of, you can pull it back up again.
Okay, and I just want to say, Dr. Glenn Parris, you're a fascinating guy. You've lived these different places. You've gone to all kinds of colleges and schools and became a doctor. And this isn't your only book, but on this book, which I'm going to read next, Dragon's Heir, like H-E-I-R, dragonsair.com. Go to that web channel and read up on it, find out about it, and attend this virtual camp.
Shameless plug.
Okay.
I just published a short story in an anthology called Where the Veil is Thin. And it's an anthology of stories about fairies, and they're all different kinds. My contribution to the anthology is a story called The Tooth Fairies. And they're about these little miniature vampires called fairies. Okay. And they feed on the loose teeth from little children. And they get stuck with trying to get a loose tooth out of this little girl's mouth who sleeps with her mouth shut.
We are out of time, but this event is Saturday, August 29th, 2020. Get involved in it. Dr. Parris, we're going to have you back, I hope. Talk about
Fantastic. I'm available.
And we'll be
I
back.
look forward to it.
We'll be back with more Central Valley Talk right after this.
Thanks, guys.